So thank you for joining us today, everyone. So for this episode today, myself and my colleague Ed Miller will be co-presenting. So we're first of all going to do a little intro to ourselves, and then I'll take the first part of the presentation, and then Ed will take the second part. So my name is Melanie Clapham. I'm a conservation biologist and I'm based in British Columbia, Canada. I'm one of the co-directors of the BearID Project, and I'm also a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Victoria within the Applied Conservation Science Lab. I work on grizzly bear research and specifically behavioural ecology of grizzly bears. And I work with a couple of different partners to do that. So 2 ecotourism partners, Nice Inlet Lodge and Wild Bear Lodge. And I also work with Namaqualis Council, which is a council of Indigenous First Nations, 5 local First Nations that I work with. And I'm going to hand over to Ed to introduce himself.
Thanks, Melanie. I'm Ed Miller. I'm on the tech side of this equation for today's talk. I'm a principal engineer at ARM. For those that aren't familiar, ARM is a developer of a lot of the processors that go into most of the devices that you might be familiar with every day. I'm in a technical marketing role there, involved in IoT and machine learning. But on the side, I do a lot of work on open source projects, technical blogs, occasionally and get involved in Kaggle competitions and some things like that. I do a lot of work under the banner of something called Hyperactive, which is just a group that my software partner and I, Mary, got involved with doing some of this work. But in addition to that, I do some mentoring in a few different organizations like the Clean Tech Open, which is a clean technology business competition. I mentored some teams there in the past, and I've also more recently gotten involved in some of the Conservation X Labs Grand Challenge, working with some of the teams involved there.
And so myself, Ed, and Mary Nguyen, who's pictured here, we are the BearID Project. So we're all directors of the BearID Project, and we develop non-invasive technologies for bears and potentially other wildlife going forward. And at the moment, we're working on facial recognition technology for grizzly bears. And we actually met on WildLabs. So funnily enough, myself and Ed and Mary actually joined WildLabs. I think it was actually even during the same week. And we were both interested in the same thing. We're both looking at facial recognition for grizzly bears. And so we were lucky enough that Stephanie actually introduced us, and that's where our collaboration and our partnership actually began. So we're really hopeful that this presentation may spur on new projects such as ours going forward. And we are an interdisciplinary team. So Ed and Mary head up the software development side of the project. And then I lead the ecological and conservation side. And I also work with Chris Daramont at UVic and our research assistant, Sophie Fowler, who's a geography student at UVic. And then we also work with Indigenous Guardians on the coast to set up camera trap networks across different traditional territories. And we're looking at using BearID in combination with camera traps to look at bear movements across landscapes, which will hopefully contribute to species management plans. And so that's just kind of a bit of an overview of the BearID project, and Ed will be talking more about the BearID project later on in the talk. But to start with, I'm going to talk a little bit about potential barriers and how to overcome them in terms of starting your own collaborative conservation technology project. And when we were thinking of ideas and thinking back to when we first started, we kind of came up with 4 main themes that I'm going to talk about today. And that is knowledge barriers, access barriers, funding barriers, and time being a barrier also. So I'm going to go through these just one at a time to start with. So first of all, if we think about knowledge barriers, knowledge could be a barrier in terms of a lack of skills across disciplines, and that kind of may seem quite harsh. It's not a criticism, but obviously the different disciplines receive different training, and so we have different kind of skills and abilities in relation to that training. And so if you are somebody from the conservation side that is wanting to approach somebody from the tech side or vice versa, it can be a little daunting. You may have the feeling of imposter syndrome because you're not too sure exactly what it is you want to talk about or the methods involved in some of these techniques. And I think also that kind of that lack of awareness leads to a lack of understanding of what's actually possible. And I think this, particularly from the conservation side, looking towards the tech side, you know, a lack of kind of understanding of what is out there, what is possible right now to do, and what may be kind of possible going forward in the future. And thinking of that kind of lack of technological knowledge, it could actually lead to duplication of effort. So if you're unaware of what kind of projects are going on within the field, then you could, you know, be starting your own project looking at one thing when there could already be a project ongoing that you could just join on to. And I also think it can be difficult if you don't have very much technological knowledge. If you are hiring consultants to do some of the development side, it can be difficult kind of engaging when you're not too sure the amount of work required or the amount of time that would take. So that can kind of potentially lead to some confusion in what you're actually contracting somebody out to do as well. And then from the opposite side, I think kind of the lack of the conservation or ecological knowledge can lead to kind of misunderstandings or a lack of knowledge on what is needed or what is actually possible to implement. And also potentially the long-term effectiveness and use of the tool or the technology that you're wanting to develop. And then moving on to access barriers then. So there's kind of three main barriers, and we don't really have time to get into each, but we can acknowledge that there are geographical, social, cultural, and financial barriers to people getting started in conservation technology and people actually being able to use the technology or have access to develop technologies. And from a kind of different perspective, data access can be a problem as well. So if you need data to, you know, if you're doing a software project to train models and things like that, it can be difficult to access pre-existing data. So that can be one thing. Or even within your project, if you're planning to collect your own data, you know, it can be difficult if you don't have access to a particular habitat, or you don't have access to a species, for example, or even access to somebody who has species expertise. So that could also be a barrier as well. Funding is quite an obvious one, but a really, really important one, I think, within conservation technology fields. And we can kind of think of the requirements in two ways. So first of all, kind of a stipend or salary requirement in terms of funding people for their time working on these projects. And that's always a really difficult one to find funding for. Well, especially I know from the ecological or conservation side, it can be really, really hard to find money to support yourself while doing this kind of research. I think that's kind of one of the main barriers that restricts research and monitoring of wildlife. And so you kind of, I think, especially for conservation technology projects, we have to think of diverse sources of funding. So we've had some success with research councils here in Canada, but that's mainly because of my academic affiliation. Then also Microsoft AI for Earth programs, they were advertising that they would cover people's time working on projects, which is really fantastic. And I think more and more people are looking towards private companies and private foundations that are a little bit more open in terms of what they are willing to fund, and so they can be great sources to find funding to actually cover your time on a project, which is always going to be a huge portion of a funding bid. And then more traditional environmental NGOs and charities can be approached for funding field costs and equipment costs and lab costs as well. And it's kind of a little bit maybe awkward to talk about, but I think it's important for us to acknowledge that there is a variation in scale in terms of salary between the two different disciplines, between the tech field and the conservation field. And so that's kind of something I think that we need to bear in mind when we're developing funding bids for conservation technology grants and things like that. And then the last one is, again, kind of obvious but important, time barriers. It takes time to build relationships, especially if you're meeting people for the first time and kind of reaching across from one sector to another. So the preparation time and the time it takes to actually establish relationships and make sure you're all on the same page, and to keep up with regular meetings, this all takes time. The development itself of whatever it is you're looking at, whether that's kind of hardware or software, even if you're not the ones that are involved in the actual development itself, there's still going to be amount of time there that is being spent on this development, and so that needs to be beared in mind. The maintenance time, so who is going to be responsible, and do they have the time to put into long-term maintenance of the of whatever it is you're developing, and also, you know, who's going to be responsible for the fixes and the supports, currently and long term as well. And I think it's also important to point out that, especially when you're kind of working in a kind of crossover between your current field and a different field, there will be some self-learning that's required. You'll need to go away and read things and learn things yourself. You can't be reliant on your other team members to kind of teach you everything. So I think you need to be able to put some time aside for some self-learning, and there's a willingness to do that, and then there's also, you know, a time ability to do that as well. So there were kind of like 4 main overall barriers, but I think it's important to acknowledge that there's also some differences between the different disciplines. And when I say, you know, conservation tech, conservation one side, tech on the other, I know that there's, you know, lots of different kind of sectors within that and subdisciplines within that, but I'm just kind of referring to both overall for now. So 3 kind of main differences that we kind of identified were differences in publishing outputs of projects, differences in sharing data, and also differences within disciplines as well between different sectors. So first of all, publishing differences is quite an interesting one, and not one that I'd actually realized before I got started on this project, was that you know, the technology sector, it appears to me anyway, to publish outputs in a bit of a different way. So for the ecology and conservation side, there's almost always the need to be publishing research and outputs in peer-reviewed journals. And often that's a requirement of funding bodies, particularly if the funding body is a conservation or an ecological, you know, charity or group. But also if you're a part of an academic and even non-profit institution, and maybe even government, there could be a kind of career requirements as well to be publishing your research in peer-reviewed journals. And obviously the tech sector or the tech field does that as well, but I've kind of noticed that there seems to be more of a focus on conference presentations and proceedings, and also preprint servers as well, which may kind of speed up getting those outputs out there to the community. So there's kind of a difference there that needs to be acknowledged, and I think if you need to publish your research in kind of multiple different formats, then obviously that's going to add additional time demands on that you need to kind of be aware of as well. And then data sharing is quite an interesting one. You know, there is slight differences between openness in terms of how willing people are and how able people are to share their data. And I think this is one that more and more ecologists and conservationists are being encouraged to share data, particularly now with many journals require including your data when you're publishing. But I think historically ecologists and conservationists have always kind of kept the data quite close to their chests. Maybe a little bit more so than the tech side, and I think that's mainly because of one, maybe because of security, but also I think it's a lot to do with the time and the funding invested in collecting ecological data, especially if it contains field work. It can take a long time to collect this kind of data, you know, sometimes more than 10 years. So it can be quite difficult to let go and you know, allow somebody else to have control of that data without you knowing how it's being used. So I think that that is one of the things that's kind of potentially restricting ecologists from posting their data just kind of openly online. Might be a mass generalization, but just kind of something to think about. I also think that maybe larger projects that have kind of more of a centralized management, maybe conservation projects anyway, may be more willing to share their data than individual research projects that are maybe led by one researcher. And then also I think there's a little bit different, but there's logistical difficulties, in sharing data. So for example, the data sets that we use for BearID Project, we use videos of video files for camera traps. And so we have these huge data sets that it's very difficult to actually share through the cloud. So we end up, posting hard drives the kind of old-fashioned way. So it could be a difficulty in terms of access from that point of view as well. And then differences within these two different disciplines in relation to the different sectors that people work in within those different disciplines. So whether it's a research-based role or an engineering and a development-based role. And again, there's going to be differences in requirements based on grants or funding, but also institutional differences and requirements based on the different sectors that people work in. Oops. And so that's kind of like an overview, a very brief overview of some of the barriers and some of the differences between these two different conservation and technology disciplines. And now I want to move on to looking at how you can kind of go about developing your idea and becoming involved in this field. So number one, of course, is to get on WildLabs and get involved in WildLabs. Use the community pages. Even if you don't feel comfortable sharing your idea, read what other people are talking about, what is being discussed. Look for names, and then research the people that are looking into these different types of developments. And also, use the hashtag Tech4Wildlife on Twitter. And even again, if you don't want to be tweeting about your own project, you can still go and search the hashtag and read about what people are talking about. And you can use that to become familiar with what type of technology is being developed at the moment within different kind of fields. And conferences is kind of an obvious one, but I think at the moment we have an opportunity to take part in conferences that maybe we wouldn't normally do, or wouldn't normally be able to because of a lot of conferences being moved online. So I think it's important that we start to look across disciplines at what is being discussed and what is being talked about and presented at different conferences. So for conservationists to look across the tech conferences and vice versa. Even if you don't have time or not able to attend the conference, you can look at the list of presenters and look at the titles of presentations and find out what people are doing and what people are talking about. And also for the conservation side, to be aware of the different types of kind of Kaggle competitions and prizes that the tech field runs. And I wasn't aware of Kaggle competitions before becoming involved. So that's really interesting to kind of keep an eye on those and see what the most recent topics are. And then a really, really important one is to assess demand. So don't just come in with your own idea, assess what is needed and what is important, and do this by speaking to local people, local groups, communities, and decision makers. And if you want to learn more about that, you can check out Doug Clark's Tech Tutors episode from a couple of weeks ago. And he went into that along with a panel in more detail. So assess things definitely always from a local scale of who would be using the technology and who it would impact and influence. And then obviously always potentially at a national and international scale, how can it be scaled up as well? It's also super important to listen to concerns and listen to opposition potentially to the technology and integrate that into your design. Don't just ignore it because it doesn't fit your plan. And then the last one kind of is relation to all of them, but communicate your ideas and try and gain confidence in talking about what it is you're interested in. It can be difficult, going back to some of those knowledge barriers, but try to let go a little bit and voice what you would like to do or what you're interested in doing, and think about the project in terms of trying to collaborate with others rather than trying to be in competition with others. And so After kind of developing your idea, you're going to want to start some initial conversations potentially with collaborators that you've met or you've found the names of and emailed, and you want to have that first meeting. And so what are some of the things that may be important to think about and to talk about during those first conversations? So we've just kind of come up with a list of a few here. I should say as well, these lists are not exhaustive. So obviously there will be other things. These are just kind of things that came to mind to us that could be important. So the first one being identifying priorities. So trying to establish what the project priorities are of different members and whether certain people have different agendas to others, and that's not meaning in a malicious way, but just trying to make sure everybody's on the same page in those initial conversations. Try and assess people's time allowances and try and be open with your own allowances of time and time availability, both right now and going forward with the project. Try to be honest in your own knowledge base, what you know and what you don't know, and try to get a good idea of what different team members' experience and knowledge base is. And mentioned this before, but definitely be prepared to do some self-learning around the topic that you're talking about if you're not too familiar with certain aspects of it. The fourth one is try to identify a shared problem, a shared conceptual problem, and a joint area of interest for you all. And this will, kind of relate back to number one, the priorities a little bit. Try and make sure that you're all on the same page and that there is a valid problem that you are going to be addressing or trying to tackle with your project, and identify if there's any kind of red flags at that point within the team in terms of differences of opinion or which isn't always a bad thing, but different priorities. And then the last one is really important to early on try and identify the intellectual property rights. Is the project going to be open access, open source? Who will own the intellectual property if not? So discuss ownership of the data and of the tool that you will be creating together. And then I put together here just some kind of lessons that we've learned so far from starting the BearID project that could be helpful to others as well. So this is kind of an overall thing. I think that honesty and openness within a collaborative team is really important. Being honest about the realities and the complexities of this kind of whatever technology it is you're developing based on your own experience, because that may be different from other members of the team. Try to avoid using discipline-specific jargon if you can, especially during those initial meetings, to try not to isolate some members. So try to be really clear in what you're talking about, and try to familiarize yourself with any terms or jargon that you're unfamiliar with if they keep popping up during these initial conversations. Another thing we've learned is that administration takes a long time, so try and incorporate it if you can into your work schedules and anticipate that it will take time. And if you can, it's important to establish a point person for the project that will be the person that will answer those emails, which we all know take a lot of time. Teams can be small and the tech can be small scale, and I think one thing that we've done is we started with just 3 people in our team, and we're kind of building upon that now and bringing in other partners. So we kind of have started with a really solid relationship between us, and now we're building upon that. And I think that that's worked quite well for us. So it may be better to start small and grow rather than start large with multiple different partners within a project. The last couple of months, we've done quite a bit of publicity in relation to the BearID project. We had our first publication that came out in November last year, and we did a press release that went along with the publication, and so we did some interviews before the publication came out and after. And that was a lot of work. That was a couple of months of work to get that all set up. And after the after the publication came out, we were doing interviews almost every day for about a month. So that links back to the time aspect as well to be aware of. But it's also led to huge opportunities for us in terms of potential funding and collaborations with other partners. So it really has increased the interest in our project, and I think has been a huge benefit and will be a huge benefit to us going forward. So try and get it out there, try and get your project out there as much as you can to drum up interest, and it really will help you going forward. one thing that's quite interesting that I wanted to mention was just kind of about the fact that this, conservation technology as it is a fairly new field, especially to some people. And so some of the research and the development that we could be doing could be quite experimental, and especially I think from a conservation point of view, can be seen as quite risky, which is usually something that we kind of stray away from in terms of conservation. We usually, especially when you're, applying for funding and things like that, you usually have to have like measurable conservation outputs. How is this going to do this? And that can be quite difficult, I think, with certain types of conservation technology projects because of the risk involved. So I think it's important to be really open from the start about potential risks and what may work and what may not work. And we tried to do this with the BearID project with our partners that we were working with from the start. We tried to kind of say, this might not work, this is a risk, but if it does work, there's huge benefits that could come with it. So I think that openness really helped us from the start, because I think that if things don't work out and you've kind of promised the world, it could affect existing relationships quite negatively. So that's just one to kind of be aware of. The next one is to have regular meetings. It's an obvious one, but when you're working in different disciplines and different sectors, and you're working on different time schedules and work schedules, it can be quite difficult to schedule meetings. So I think since we've had more regular meetings, more established meetings, we have improved in terms of our time and our development of the project. So it is important to keep up with regular meetings, even if you think you've not really got anything to talk about. It's always important to engage with the whole group. And then the last one is about nuance in terms of results of conservation technology projects. And this is something that I've noticed since talking to others within ecology and conservation about the use of BearID. And I think it's particularly just kind of being open and acknowledging what our technology can do and what it can't do, how it can be applied right now, or maybe it's a case where we're learning about how it works right now, but maybe it shouldn't be applied in the field directly right now until we know more about how it works. And so I've just kind of put two examples here. One from one of something that I learned from Sarah Beery's WildLabs presentations was looking at species ID on camera traps and then trying to apply that in different habitats. You may not get the same levels of performance as what is discussed in papers and other things like that. So that's kind of something that I think is important, because some people could read outputs of these development projects and say, oh, fantastic, 97%, that's amazing, now we can go and use that. But actually we need to be vocal and kind of acknowledge that there's a little bit more to it, and we need to kind of look at how this varies, different habitats, different species. This is quite, software and machine learning specific, but I think it can be applied to hardware development too. So just to be open and to acknowledge that perhaps the technology isn't at a stage, it's at a stage where we want to communicate about it, but maybe not at a stage yet where we're ready to implement it directly in the field. And then I put a little timeline here together, but I am just going to skip over it because I noticed that we are running a little short on time. So I wanted to leave this in case you want to go back and look at it on the recording. But this is just a timeline of kind of when we got started and the different kind of main points along the way to where we are right now. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Ed Miller for the rest of the presentation.
Hey Ed, just so you know, you're muted.
Thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Most common statement from 2020, I believe.
Look. Just while we're waiting, hey everyone, just so you know, you can use the chat to ask questions that pop up as Ed and Melanie are talking, and we'll have them there so you can throw to them at the end of the session. All right.
Great. Hopefully I'll be able to wrap up pretty quickly. Thanks, Melanie, for covering all that good information on collaboration. I thought I'd talk a little bit about the BearID project and especially how we came at it from the technology side of things. So as I said, I'm an engineer and as in my background, and I got involved in this kind of by accident. I was starting out looking for some exercises to help me learn about machine learning, and I was also an avid viewer of the Brooks Falls bear cam from Katmai National Park. And this is where I really started to understand and learn about identifying bears. And I thought, well, what better project to start with than trying to see if we could apply machine learning to identify the bears on the camera. So that was kind of the motivation and inspiration that Mary and I took when we started to work on this project together. And of course, the main thing that you need to get started at that point is data. So our first stop on that discovery tour was the Brooks Falls, the rangers at Katmai National Park. We knew from watching the cam that they have a long-term study that's been going on there for many decades. You know, this natural resource of the Brooks Falls barrier, where salmon spawning every year just draws this massive number of bears, has enabled them to study these bears in that area for a very long time. And they have a quite regular program now that they've been running for, I believe, a couple of decades now, where they have you know, regular monitoring sessions in the spring and in the fall, and they keep track of all the bears that visit the river and all this sort of thing. And of course, photo documentation is a big part of what they do. So one of our first stops was talking to the rangers at Katmai National Park and asking them if they're willing to provide some of the data. And you know, fortunately, for a national park, it's pretty much an open source, open data policy for the parks. They collect all their data using government funding, so they're generally willing to share that. So that was a good place for us to get started. You know, they've been putting together these bear books and identifying these bears for so many years that yeah, they already had things separated out and identified by bears. So that was pretty good, because labeling was going to be the next big challenge for us. But we did find, you know, of course, they weren't collecting these photos to identify bears from their faces. So their photos weren't always suitable to what we were, what our needs were. So even though we got probably 12,000 or something photographs from them initially, you know, we had probably a third or less than a third of that we actually could make use of. But yeah, finding a good data source, it was definitely one of the first challenges. And then as we started to explore that a bit further, and as Melanie discussed, we kind of met through Wild Labs. We kind of two things happened. One, we got to expand the data set after we worked with Melanie for a while, and she brought forth the stuff that she's been working on for also more than 10 years in the Knight Inlet area of British Columbia. And not only did we have access to that additional data, but we really started to understand that this project had environmental and conservation applications that were beyond, you know, just, oh, which bear is on the bear cam at this time. So that was really what kind of turned the page for us and brought this from just kind of a learning project to something that, hey, this really has application for conservation goals. And so this was pretty exciting for us. Melanie from her project and Mary and I from our project were approaching things from opposite directions, but you know, we had really the same end goals in mind, and I think we've really managed to establish a good relationship and move forward with this project. You know, one of the challenges around identifying something like a brown bear is, so, you know, first of all, for us, when you're not familiar with them, you know, all the brown bears kind of look the same, but once you start watching them more regularly, you learn how you can identify them using different traits about their appearance, about their behavior, about where they are, how they fish, all kinds of different cues that we use to identify these bears. But you also find that a single bear can look different at different times of the year in different conditions. So these photographs are all of Lenore, one of the bears that Melanie studies. And yeah, depending on the time of the year and what Lenore is up to, that they look quite different. So these are the kinds of challenges that we need to face for a machine learning project. Another challenge is balanced data sets. That's always a big challenge in machine learning as well. We have some bears that are seen quite frequently, or maybe they're ones that are somehow especially charismatic and people like to photograph them, and we get lots and lots of photos of those few bears. But the complete range of bears, we have a lot less photos for some than others. So one of the challenges we need to overcome there is how to get a balanced data set, maybe trying to remove some of the bears where we don't have much representation, or expanding upon the data set by trying to work with people to get more photographs of those bears. But yeah, generally these are some of the kinds of challenges that we need to work through. And one of the important aspects of machine learning that a lot of people apply is something called transfer learning. So the basic idea that you gain knowledge solving one problem and you're able to apply it to a different but related problem. And a lot of cases, this is used a lot in things like machine learning classification, where you're just trying to identify what's in the photograph that you're looking at, or what's in a video. And you have a lot of data sets out there like ImageNet, which is a huge collection of just photographs of all kinds of scenarios and all kinds of objects. And there's a lot of networks that have been trained on this because it's used a lot as a benchmark for researching. And if you start with one of these networks where it's really learned how to identify a broad range of different items that you might see in the real world, then you can start fine-tuning those networks by applying the specific data that you care about. And we came at that, one of the things that gave us a big head start at the very beginning of this project is we came across this demonstration program from a library called DLib, which is a C++ library that helps you do machine learning applications. And one of the sample applications for object detection was this thing called the dog hipsterizer, where it would basically find a dog face in a photo and then apply sunglasses glasses and a mustache to the dog. And from a fairly silly project or example program, we realized that this actually worked quite well for bears, as you can see from the photos on the right. And this was actually the basis for one of the methods that we decided to adopt for our initial approach, was using face identification for bears. So now, rather than having to go and take these thousands of bear images that we have and draw boxes around their faces and identify their eyes and nose, we already had an application that was pre-trained to do this. And even though it was trained on dogs, it generalized somewhat to bears and gave us a big head start. And so we actually ran with this all the way through our first version of the application before we actually had a big enough data set on our own, where we've gone through and hand labeled and fixed some of the labels that the dog hipsterizer was doing for the bears and retrained that to make an actual bear identification version of that. But yeah, there's lots of places you can go and look for inspiration and find things that can give you a huge head start on these types of projects. And so we used that again for the first steps of this face identification algorithm, and this is kind of based on the Google FaceNet project from 2015. It's just kind of a typical algorithm that a lot of people are using. But we use this dog hipsterizer as a starting point to find those bear landmarks so we could then reorient the face. And then having a normalized face makes it a little bit easier for teaching a network how to identify the individuals. And so our end-to-end flow is basically using that face detection to create a chip, which is just the actual bear face of a small image. And then we make use of something called an embedding network, and there's lots of different names for this, metric learning, Siamese networks, hinge loss, triplet loss. There's lots of different ways to go on and look at this. But the basic idea is it's a network that learns when two images are very similar. It puts them very close together in this kind of large vector space. And when they're different images, it tries to put them far apart in the same space. And then you can tell how similar two photos are, or whether the same individual, just by checking the distance between this embedding that gets produced by the network. And so that's kind of the core of the identification algorithm for us. And then at the end of that, you put a classifier that takes that embedding vector and classifies it into the specific ID of the bears that you're interested in. And then, yeah, if you have more interest in the details on that, as Melanie mentioned, we published our first paper back in November. So that's open access, and the source code for the BearID project is also all open source on GitHub. So all the information is there to learn about that. So last year we started to have our first opportunity where this was actually usable in some semblance in the field. So, you know, here's Melanie out on the estuary at Glendale Cove in the Knights Inlet, photographing the bears that she's studying. You can see she's taken a nice shot of one of the bears on the shoreline on the far side there. Just pops out her SD card, which, you know, this is probably not advised to do on a regular basis while you're sitting in a boat out in an estuary. But yes, she's loaded her photos onto her laptop, and we provided the BearID application in a Docker container, so she's able to run it on her laptop. It analyzes the set of bears, the set of photos that she's just taken, and provides an XML file that can be viewed in just a common web browser. And so here she is looking at the photograph that she just took of that bear, and there it is. It's Lenore from earlier in the presentation. And that's pretty much how kind of our first round of field use works, and now we're working together to take that to the next level, make this more usable and more scalable. And as Melanie said, we're starting to work a little bit more with other partners to understand how we can broaden the scope of the application and access to it. And that's pretty much all I had. I want to, definitely thank all of our collaborators and all of our supporters, and especially Wild Labs, who helped us get together and who invited us here today. We probably wouldn't be here without Stephanie helping make the initial connection for us. And so we really appreciate that. And we're looking forward to what we can do together and what we can do as a community to bring technology into solving some of the biggest problems facing the natural world.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much for sharing your valuable experience. I'm sure we're all feeling very prepared and inspired to start our own Tech4Wildlife collaborations. So we do have some time left for a few questions. I'm going to start with an opening question. So I think we've probably got quite a few different people in the audience from both, you know, interested in the collaborative side and maybe interested in more of the ML aspects of BearID. But I want to start with just a general question about collaboration, which I think Talia actually mentioned at some point. So what do you think is the #1 barrier to tech collaborations, and what is something that this community can do to overcome that?
I think the biggest one, which I guess I kind of overall discussed in the presentation, but it wasn't a specific barrier, is meeting each other, coming together, which is, you know, why we came together on Wild Labs, and that's why we talked in this presentation about trying to get people to talk about their ideas on the community pages and be open, even if you don't have a fully developed idea, even if you're just like, hey, I work on this and we need this, or is this possible? So I think that being open about communicating ideas and therefore being able to meet other people that are also interested in what you're interested in is probably one of the big barriers. And then also leading on from that is the funding to actually get the project started, which is, again, always a big one, I know, to, you know, mention, but I think that really does kind of hinder what is possible. So I think that, you know, if going forward there's more programs like the Microsoft AI for Earth, then that will really help to encourage people to get started in these kind of projects.
Okay, thank you. So going on to audience questions, Peter, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So my name is Peter. I'm more of on the tech side of things. I'm a back-end engineer, and I've recently been trying to kind of enter the conservation space. Because I had some machine learning experience, I was quite happy to see that there is a lot of applications in the field, but at the same time, as you mentioned in the presentation, you do get that kind of imposter syndrome where, because you're not, you know, I've not studied machine learning officially. So I'm kind of curious to hear if there are other kind of non-machine learning applications or needs in this space where you need kind of developers to help you out in some way.
Yeah. So you were meaning non-machine learning, but still software based within kind of conservation and ecology, or?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of well, not my speciality, but this is the field that I'm in. So I am not too familiar off the top of my head with specific needs of other researchers, but I can definitely think of hardware requirements in terms of like actual physical tools that researchers can use, and the expense of buying off the shelf hardware, and there's probably, you know, software that goes along with that. Software for processing data, so whether it be, you know, camera trap data or data collected with other devices, that's a huge one, I think, especially right now while people are trying to use kind of standardized software and encourage the, you know, conservation community to share data and to store data in the same way. And so I think that there's a big kind of opportunity there to ask the tech sector for help in how we process data more quickly and more accurately. And so, yeah, I think that there's kind of opportunities to try and kind of help out. It just depends on, you know, what data type people are working with. But yeah, I think the processing aspect of data that is being collected could be quite an important one.
Okay, thank you very much.
And on that note, don't forget to join Wild Labs, Peter. There's lots of chat going on about different kinds of non-ML tech projects in that space.
Can I just say also, Tatiana, sorry, I think it's great that when people acknowledge from both sides that there's imposter syndrome going back and forth. So we all feel a little bit uncomfortable about talking to people that, you know, are not from our particular field. So I think it just helps to really kind of acknowledge that. So thanks, Peter, for saying that, because I think it helps to know that back and forth, that we're both aware that there is knowledge gaps, and we can both kind of learn things, you know, from each other.
Absolutely.
Yep, definitely. Yeah.
Our next question is from CJ.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I've been having audio issues, so. So I've been working for a few years with a researcher at the University of Manitoba using whisker prints for polar bear IDs. So you're both nodding. I assume you've heard about it.
Yes.
So I guess we're kind of starting to think about our next step in doing this, and we started kind of delving into machine learning when it comes to our beluga whale project. And I think the whisker prints is great, but it's kind of old technology now. So I guess any advice, because we've always used profile photos, have you guys tried different markers on the actual face of the bears? Does it have to be kind of a head-on photo? And do you find that aging in the bears changes the recognition success?
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, you know, one thing is we're starting to look at how well does this application work across other bear species. So you know, keep an eye on this space for any info on that side of things. But yeah, the current application that we're using very much depends on full frontal face view. That's not so much a hard requirement for the machine learning. Mostly that's what our face detection algorithm requires. It's kind of expects kind of two eyes to be in the image, which is not to say that it couldn't be trained to learn to find profile faces instead. But as I said, we started from that dog hipsterizer, which was kind of a face-on application, and we were kind of modeling it after the human face detection. So we're looking for two eyes and the nose as the key markers for finding that face, and then trying to be able to reorient that face to some extent to be able to have it more regularized while it was learning. But yeah, I think there are definitely different areas we want to experiment with. Can we identify these bears from their full body, from profiles, from different views? I think that there's a lot of opportunity to explore in that area. In terms of aging and things like that, we definitely see some issues. You know, our initial round of training, we had data based from roughly up through about 2016 or so from the bears that Melanie works with. And when we first started trying them with bears in the field in 2018, we realized that, you know, some of the especially younger bears that were maybe still in kind of the subadult stage, they changed significantly enough that the network really wasn't recognizing them anymore. So we need to make sure we're refreshing that and bringing it up to kind of their latest looks. But we feel like, and we don't have the quantitative numbers on this yet, but we feel like as they've reached that more mature and stable age, they're being recognized more regularly from season to season. But we need to do more analysis around that, and we now have a larger set of data from the Brooks Falls area in Katmai National Park that goes all the way back to 2006. So we can start looking at subsets of that data and see how well, you know, training it on a subset of years to see how well that extends into future years and so on. So definitely a lot more work to be done around that.
Awesome.
We should keep in touch too, CJ, and we can, we'll send you an email, or if you send us an email, it would be good to keep in touch.
Yeah, I would love that. I think there's a lot of opportunities, and we've been talking with Doug Clark a little bit with his trail camera stuff. So we're hoping. I'm at the Assiniboine Park Zoo, so we have 9 bears that were from the wild, and we've been taking photos of them over time so that we can start looking at that aging and how it affects the whisker patterns. But yeah, I think this technology would really suit the project a lot better.
Awesome.
So I'll reach out to you guys.
Sounds
Sounds great.
Can I also say how much joy it gave me to read about how you sort of co-opted dog hipsterizer for BearID. Quite ingenious, but it does also give me a little giggle.
No matter what presentation we're doing, we've always got to have a bear with a mustache.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's just not BearID.
Yeah. So we've got 2 more questions. If you're both still happy to stick around a little longer. Fantastic, thank you. So next is Rob.
I have about 100 questions and many comments, so I'll just take up the next 7 hours if that's all right by you guys. No, look, amazing example of collaboration, very inspirational to all of us who are trying to do similar things. My question is actually a bit technical though, in relation to your ID project, and I think it sort of covers both the technical challenges and maybe also the ecological element. So, one thing we do when we're IDing animals is we do a lot of ruling out. We kind of go, we took this photo of we study dingoes here. And so we will go, this is a male, which immediately rules out, females. It's a tag male. It was seen in X area. And we kind of narrow it down to a set of, animals that we can then kind of start to look at more specifically. And I'm just interested from a technical point of view. I know that I know virtually nothing about machine learning, but it seems quite a dense process where the neural network is built using some really kind of obscure things that aren't very intuitive to humans. And that's not the way that maybe a human would, like I just described, ID an animal. Is there any crossover there, or is there any use of metadata to kind of go, right, we know that bear cannot be this female from that area and so on? Is any work being done on that front?
Yeah, there's definitely a little bit of that going on. Certainly the geographical location is one that we make use of today. We get much better results we have 2 primary sets of data right now, the ones from Melanie's bears in British Columbia, and then the ones from Katmai National Park in Alaska, and they're clearly not going to be the same bears in both areas. So we definitely are just looking at the location where the image was from, or where the camera trap is located, and using that as a first marker. I think some of the other markers could also be very interesting to make use of. Some of them we just haven't done so because we frankly don't yet understand how to best make use of them in the technology. And definitely areas that we want to continue to explore, but yeah, using the sex of the bear, where it was more specifically located. These are a lot of things, as you said, that the researchers use to help identify, but yeah, some of those things are just a little bit more challenging to integrate with the machine learning approach. So there's probably a room for a higher level application that kind of looks at some of that metadata and helps sort through those different options.
And Ed, correct me if I'm wrong, but I mean, you know, theoretically, you could potentially have multiple networks kind of linked together. So you could do your species ID initially and then send it to a different network that potentially could do sex ID and then could send it to a network for males or for females, potentially, which could then do ID on those specific, you know, or be trained on just on males or just on females.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a concept of kind of ensemble networks where you've got multiple networks looking at either trying to do the same method of identification using a different algorithm or using different methods of identification, and then you can look at those kind of at a meta level and you know, glean information from each of those and use that to help you determine with more accuracy an identification. So a lot of these different markers could be fed into a system like that.
Thanks guys, great talk.
Thank you.
Great. So our last question is from Helen, and I'm going to expand on her question a little bit to make it into our closing question. So Helen asks, Melanie, when are you going to move into IDing black bears? And in addition to that, I wonder if you could also just generally tell us a little bit about what's next for you and BearID, and where do you see the future of machine learning and Tech4Wildlife collaborations going?
Yeah, so we actually have a black bear data set that's coming together quite nicely. Well, we've received some black bear footage so far, actually from MPG Ranch in Montana. So they've been fantastic with sending us some camera trap footage that they've been collecting for kind of 10 years or so. So so far we have that data set. So it's definitely something that you were kind of looking at. We're delving more into our grizzly networks and looking at how we can kind of increase our accuracy and looking a bit more at how they work and how they perform. But then also we are, as kind of Ed mentioned earlier, we are looking to test it on different bear species. There's definitely lots of interest. You know, I'm based in British Columbia, so there's lots of interest in black bears, particularly, you know, Vancouver Island. But wolves, there's lots of interest in as well. There's lots of interest in caribou up here as well because of endangered populations. So yeah, we've had quite a few people reach out to inquire as to how it can be kind of applied to their species that they're working on. So we're just kind of potentially working with some other partners to maybe help speed that up a little bit going forward. And so we can kind of concentrate potentially on the bears. So yeah, so we've not kind of started yet, but we're in the process of applying to other bear species and seeing how it performs. And assessing data sets from other people as well, because that's one thing people contact us about, how this can be applied to, you know, another species. But first of all, we have to look at whether we could collect the training data required for that species. So that's kind of, you know, one potential little barrier that we have to kind of find out more about when we're starting these conversations, is whether the researcher, whoever it may be, has access to training data that we could use, what it looks like, how long it's been collected. And also, like, I think it's important to kind of have some species specific kind of expertise initially to discuss about, you know, what is stable about this animal that we could use to conduct the recognition, you know, particularly for species that don't have distinguishing body markings. We need to know, like, well, if it does have a pattern on its body, is that pattern stable over time or not? So those are all kind of questions that we'll be asking people that get in touch with us about applying this to other species, to try and get to the bottom of what could be the most stable aspect. And I mean, that's why we chose the face for grizzlies, because they sometimes do have, you know, different colors and patterns on the coat, but that all molts and changes over a year, so it's not what we class as a stable feature. So you need some kind of species expertise to kind of know that and understand that, and that will, you know, kind of influence what we decide to focus on. I don't know, Ed, if you have anything to kind of add.
Yeah, I think you touched on that fairly well. I think for the more general question about where things are going, I think we're really at a good point right now where technologists and conservationists are really becoming aware of each other. I think, you know, platforms like WildLabs have done a great job in bringing those communities together. And I think we're really at kind of the start of what I hope is something that's going to blossom into something much bigger. I think one of the big challenges is, you know, we have a lot of people in the tech community that are very interested in the environment, in climate change, in a lot of the big problems that scientists are trying to tackle. And, you know, they're getting involved in those things earlier, getting involved with them for their, you know, master's theses or looking at their PhD projects and doing some of those things. But the big challenge then comes with, you know, when they're looking to go into industry, are they able to continue working in the conservation field, or are they going to go work for Tesla or Apple or Google and all the big tech companies that are just snapping up the best talent in areas like machine learning and in application development? You know, how can we continue to bolster the field where there is a viable career path on the technology side? You know, for me, I happen to work at a company that's, you know, leans well into the aspect of, you know, ARM is one of the supporters of Flora and Fauna, which is the parent group for WildLabs. So they're a great company to work for in that regard. But again, this is a part-time passion project for me. You know, my day job is not to go and identify bears. I have other work that I need to do to maintain my kind of tech work and tech credentials, I suppose. Yeah, so I hope to see more opportunities growing around the value of protecting wild species in this world and all the other problems that we have, all the global challenges that we're facing, where technology can really help. So I'm hoping to see that really grow into a burgeoning career path for aspiring technologists.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to you both for sharing your expertise. I feel like I've learned a lot about collaboration and machine learning. As per usual, there'll be a little after-hours session if anyone is keen to stick around for some casual chat and some casual collaboration. Next week, we are doing another ML-themed episode. It's on ML Ops, so you can find out more probably in the chat about that or on the WildLabs website.